Thank you all for joining. This is, in fact, the correct place. If you thought that you were coming to how to use AI for fast and accurate production scheduling, you are here. My name's Eli. I just want to say from the beginning, I know that AI, there's a lot of sort of hype about AI right now. And because of that, I feel like people sort of generally fit into two categories. There are the people who are like very optimistic about AI, are very curious about it, want to see how it can help them in their work or help them in their lives, who see how AI can be useful. And then there's like the other half of people who are like very skeptical about AI or pessimistic about what it can do, or just don't think that it's all it's hyped up to be. And I'm sure that we have a lot of people from both categories. I assume we probably have more of the sort of optimists here because this is a webinar about how to use AI. But I will just admit freely that I am in camp two. I am an AI skeptic and cynic. Anytime I read another article about how AI is going to change all of our lives, my eyes roll so far up in my head that I can see my own thoughts. But I do think that even for the other AI cynics who are out there, like myself, there's going to be some interesting stuff for you to see in this product. I feel like this particular product, what we're going to show you today as part of Flow, it's showing how you can use AI in order to further what you're doing as a human being. It's an extension of humans, which is what tools should be. So I'll let the other cynics in the room, reserve your judgment for the end. But that's just sharing from my own personal perspective there. My name is Eli Rary. Before I worked at Autodesk, I worked as a production manager and as a pipeline coordinator in the pipeline department for several different visual effects and animation houses in America. And then I came to work here at Autodesk, where I specialize in a tool known as Flow Production Tracking. This tool used to be called ShotGrid, and ShotGrid used to be called Shotgun. The same product. It's not, we haven't changed what it does. We just changed the name a few times. So flow production tracking is not the sole topic of what we're talking about today in the webinar. But it is a lot of what we're talking about. So I just want to make sure that we have like a baseline of knowledge about flow production tracking. Let me actually run a little poll right now. We're going to do a few of these polls over the course of this webinar, and makes it a little more interactive, which I think is a little bit more fun. And I can see that there's some people who have yet to try flow production tracking. So I am going to do a little bit of talking about what flow production tracking is, what it might be useful for. But the bulk of this presentation will not be about flow production tracking. So if you're wondering, you're like, oh, I already know this. Don't worry, I'm only going to talk about this for a minute. So when you're working on a new project, there's a lot of information that passes back and forth through a lot of different tools. This is normal. It can be a little bit chaotic. If you're just working on one project, or if the project isn't too complex, then this is not a big deal. You can, send emails and use Google Docs and send Slack messages, and the data can go in a lot of different directions, and you can manage to keep on top of it. But as soon as you start to have a more complex project, or you have multiple projects, then you start to need a tool that's going to help with the collaboration overall. So that tool is flow production tracking. We design it as a hub of information. So the idea is that all the different tools that you're using are going to send their data to flow production tracking, and that's going to share it with the wider team. So it's a collaboration tool, much like Slack or email, but it's a little bit different because it's an actual database. It's got a database on the back end. So that means that it's a web-based tool. You're using it inside of Firefox or inside of Chrome. But on the back end, there's a database that's carrying the lists of all the tasks, all the shots, everything that you're working on as part of whatever this project is. And it surfaces that information depending on what you're doing, what you're trying to accomplish, whether you're doing production management or other aspects of the tool. So I'm going to just very briefly show you a little bit about what flow production tracking does. So this is the tool. You've got your different projects here. I'm going to go into the Dreadnoughts project. And then I can see the different shots. In this case, the Dreadnoughts project is a film with visual effects that's being done on it. We've got these CG vehicles that are going to be put into live action footage. So I've got different shots that I'm working on. I've got different assets that I need to create. I've got a list of these assets here. And you can see that this looks a lot like an Excel spreadsheet. It's customizable. I can choose what columns I'm going to look at. I can even create my own custom columns to show whatever data is important to me. And then I've got these color-coded columns that have tasks inside them. So this is where I can assign a modeling task for a particular asset. I can also filter based on this information. So I always just want to see the particular information that's relevant to me. So this is a tool for production managers and for everyone on the team to be able to update, look at the information that's most relevant to them. But we also integrated into this tool the possibility of doing visual review. And this is where I feel like flow production tracking really sets itself apart from a lot of the competition, that it's got task management, task tracking tools, and then it also has visual review embedded in the same tool. Because in our industry, if there's a task that needs to be done, and you need to mark, hey, this task is finished, or this task is still in progress, usually the moment that a task shifts from being in progress to being final is a moment of where someone's reviewing some kind of visual material. So having all that integrated into one platform is, I think, what's really set flow production tracking apart from some of the competition. All the information that's in flow production tracking can be represented visually. It can also be exported for use in other tools. It can be exported for use in Excel. It can be exported as a JSON. It's got an API so that it can push stuff out into other tools. It can integrate with other tools. So this also makes flow production tracking pretty powerful, as integrating into part of a pipeline. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we move on to talking about the AI tools that I'm going to focus on for the rest of the webinar. So I really want to talk about scheduling. This is the main topic of the webinar today, is talking about scheduling. So let's get into scheduling in flow production tracking. So flow production tracking uses task templates in order to make scheduling happen really quickly. So here I've got a series of shots, and I'm going to schedule those shots using task templates. I set the first start date for the first task, and it immediately sets all the other tasks. I set the layout task. It already knows animation follows from layout, and it's able to schedule all those. I set this up by setting up a template that had these dependencies and all this information in it. And it makes scheduling go really quickly to have these templates and be able to quickly apply them to a shot or to an asset or whatever it is that I'm working on. Now, let's say that I've created the schedule. I used templates and I set them up and I created a schedule very quickly. And now I have start and end dates for every task on every shot and every asset in my project. And now we start production. Now, of course, nothing is going to change during production. We're not going to get any new information. No deadlines are going to change. We're actually just going to do the exact schedule the same way that I set it up from the very beginning, right? No. What's going to happen is that we're going to get changes in deadlines. We're going to get changes in when we get the information we need to start, which is going to push stuff to happen later. We're going to need stuff to be done sooner than it is on the schedule. We're going to get shots that are supposed to be in the trailer. All these different things can happen, which change during production. And then there's, of course, that tasks don't take the amount of time that they were supposed to take on the schedule. Tasks take longer, and then stuff gets pushed out. So changes happen in the course of production. So updating the schedule for these types of changes is a manual process. It's exactly the same process you just saw me do, where I'm dragging the tasks back and forth. I'm updating the start date and the due date on individual tasks. If you've got hundreds of tasks on your project, this is an extremely time-consuming process. Now, you have to do this day to day. It's constant that you're updating tasks, you're updating what's going on, you're updating the schedule. That is part of my job as a production manager. If I'm a production manager, I've got to be constantly updating the schedule based on what's happening in reality. But when you get these big changes that come in that really disrupt the schedule, it can be a huge problem, where it gets to the point that it's impossible for me to update hundreds of tasks and know that they're in line with the new information that the production has gotten. So then you start to go into stuff where you're sort of going on hopes and wishes. You're like, I've got most of the schedule in here. It's mostly correct, and we got to just keep going because we don't have time to slow down. We're like we're in the middle of flying the plane, so to speak. So that can where you can end up with more overtime, you can end up with rush work, you can end up with reduced profits, and most of all, it's a difficult experience. It can reduce morale when we feel like we don't have control over the schedule anymore. That can be really difficult. So what if, just what if, there was a tool where you could take the schedule that you had and you could put it into the tool and you could say, hey, I need to add a new constraint. I need to finish 1 week earlier. This sequence is not going to be delivered to us for another month. So this sequence has to move later. Can you redo my schedule for me using AI and tell me what my schedule should look like? Well, that's the tool that I'm here to introduce. It's called Flow Generative Scheduling. So this is an additional capacity that we're adding to the Flow platform. So we've got Flow Production Tracking, and now with Flow Production Tracking, we also have Flow Generative Scheduling, which is a new tool that's integrated very closely with Flow Production Tracking, allowing additional scheduling capabilities that aren't available in Flow Production Tracking. So we're now going to talk about what's in Flow Generative Scheduling and how that tool works. So this is the tool. You can see the schedule looks a lot like what you might see in Flow Production Tracking. It's pretty recognizable. You can see shots. You can see the tasks that are associated with those shots. And now I'm looking at a very different view. So these are those tasks, but represented in terms of resources. And I want you to look at the peaks and valleys in this graph, where you can see that there's times when I need more people. This is a resource graph, so it's showing me how many people in the lighting department I need to complete the tasks that are assigned to the lighting department. So I can zoom in on this task, I can zoom out, and I can see where there's times that I need more people, and then there's times when it's reduced. And I can look at all my departments together, or I can look at the departments separated out. So this is a different way of looking at my schedule. But then I also want to do something different with my schedule here. I want to add a constraint. I'm going to say I'm going to start no earlier than December 2nd. So my whole show has now been moved to start later. Now, it might still finish. It might still have the same deadline for finishing, but it's going to have a new start date. So I hit this purple generate button, and it generates a new schedule. So it's now adjusted the start and end dates for all of these tasks. It's respecting those dependencies, but look at the peaks and valleys. What it's doing is it's trying to use math, AI, in order to set this resourcing to have as little peaks and valleys as possible. And you can see on the left-hand side, I've got these two different scenarios. I've got my baseline scenario and my initial pass. So my baseline scenario has a lot of these peaks and valleys, and then my initial pass with generative scheduling is leveling all those out. And this is the reason that that generative scheduling, it's an AI tool, but it's not a large language tool or a large language model. I'm not an AI person, obviously, but it's not using a lot of other people's schedules. It's not looking at a list of schedules and saying, oh, these are what good schedules look like, and I'm going to imitate them. Instead, it has its own model for what a good schedule looks like that doesn't have to do with someone else's data or with your data. It has to do with the idea that an optimized schedule has this level line where you don't have these peaks of resourcing and then drips. You want everybody to be working steadily throughout. Let me get a little bit more deeper into the tool. So if I look at this one department, the compositing department, I'm not going to immediately have 50 people or 100 people working in this department. I need people to slowly roll into the compositing department from the last show. So I'm going to create this ramp in, and then I'm going to redo this schedule. Now, because of this ramp at the beginning and this ramp out at the end, it actually is going to mean I'm going to need more people overall when I'm at my peak. But it's setting that as part of the constraints. And I can then, again, compare my initial pass to my adjusted pass. So I can say, oh, this is what it looked like before I set these ramps for each department. This is what it looks like after. And I can start to make decisions based on what I see here. This tool is not going to be useful if I just have to hit the generate button and then accept whatever it gives me. I really need to be able to work with the tool, add additional constraints, and get into the details. Let me get into some more details here. Here, I'm going to take a look at the overall project. So this is the whole project. It's a demo project. It's got all these sequences in it. So these are the different sequences that are part of the project. So I can actually set constraints at the project level, and I can set constraints at the individual sequence level. So for now, let me set a project level constraint. I'm going to say that the project has to finish by, let's say, August 1st. So project's got to be done. Everything in the project has to be done by August 1st. But then I can go into an individual sequence and set a priority and say this sequence has a higher priority than this sequence. So do all the same math that you are doing in order to try to level the resourcing, in order to try to make adjustments in order for everything to flow, but also give this a higher priority. And then take this individual shot, and I'm going to add a constraint that this shot can't start until December 2nd, because I'm not going to get the information to be able to do AAB0001. So I can really get quite detailed about individual shots, individual sequences, and I can set various constraints in order to control the whole thing. Again, I hit my purple generate button, the AI magic happens. And then I can compare what's happened in this new version with the last version. I'm going to pause here. There's a lot more to show you and to talk about generative scheduling. But I do want to do a little poll now. We already did one poll. Let's do a second poll. I just want to know, basically, I think this poll is about whether or not you have used or tried generative scheduling. Generative scheduling is available now. So I'm just curious if you have had a chance to try it out, or if this is the first time that you're seeing it. Seems like a few people have tried it out, but that most of you, this is the first chance that you're getting to see the tool. I do want to open it up for questions if folks have questions. I will ask for more questions at the end of the presentation, but I wanted to take a break at this point. So one question that we have is, when will it be rolled out to existing Flow customers? It is already live, so you do not have to wait. It is in your Flow production tracking. I'm going to go into more detail about that immediately. That's the next topic of discussion. One of the questions is, can the start and end drafts on the graph be saved between sessions, or is it reset each time it loads? All right, let me talk a little bit about what scenarios are and sort of how they work. So the idea with scenarios is each time you run the generate button, you're affecting that particular scenario. And then you can duplicate that scenario and make a new one, and then you can make adjustments, and then run that purple button again. The idea is, this is something that's not available in production tracking at all. Is the idea of a schedule scenario. Anything you change in the schedule in Flow production tracking is immediately available to the everyone on the project. It is part of the schedule, every change that you make. There's no way to make some changes, look at them, and then decide you want to commit to them. The opposite is true in generative scheduling. In Flow generative scheduling, everything that you do is in your little playground. It's your scenarios. Only you can see your scenarios. If you want to share it with the rest of the team, you have to push it to Flow production tracking. And I'm about to talk about how that works. So there's no saving particularly. It just exists in that scenario. And if you want to hang on to it, then you duplicate the scenario when you make changes, and then you'll have that sort of duplicate backup that you've created. So one question that we have here, I'm going to read the question from Jennifer. Thank you for your question. Aside from the project as a whole, what if the deliverable of concern isn't a sequence? What if it's a mission or some other entity? So I'm going to make some guesses about Jennifer. I'm going to guess that you work in possibly the games industry, and you're not working on sequences, you're not working on shots, you're working on missions or levels, some other type of thing that still involves assets, involves animations. It's the same type of work, but it's just organized in a different fashion in a game than it is in a film. You can make whatever you want, is the short answer. So yes, you can decide that it's missions, you can decide that it's assets. Generative scheduling doesn't really care what you're scheduling. It's really most interested in that there are tasks. If you have tasks assigned to this thing, then generative scheduling will work on those tasks. It doesn't care what those tasks are assigned to. And this is also true in Flow production tracking in general, that Flow production tracking allows you to create your own custom entities. One question that we have here is, does this include artist velocity tracking and apply that to the scheduling or a skill level field? In other words, some artists might take 3 days to do this task. Another artist might take 2 days to do this task. Do we have some way of saying that there are different levels of artists in the team? We do not. So the way that Flow production tracking works today, and keep in mind that this is something that we're still in development on. We're eagerly awaiting your feedback as you start using it in production. We want to hear what you need to make the tool more useful, and just to see what you're able to accomplish with it. But the way that it works now is quite simple, and we intentionally wanted to start very simple so that it would be easy to understand how the tool works and what it does, and then we could add in more complexity as we hear from you what that complexity is needed. But we wanted to get the tool in your hands as quickly as possible. But to answer your question, it doesn't have the sense that a task could take longer from one person or shorter than another person. A task has one fixed duration. This is also true in Flow production tracking, that a task has a fixed duration. But in Flow production tracking, you can assign a person to it and then see who's assigned to it and make an adjustment. In generative scheduling, you can't assign a person. There's no people associated with the tasks. They're always in the sort of general, nameless, someone will do this state. It's only when the schedule's pushed into Flow production tracking that artists get assigned. Ricardo asks, how does it determine a department? What a wonderful question. I will be answering it shortly. It's in the later part of my presentation. I'm not trying to trick you or something. Does Flow have the ability to assign tasks to users? It does not. It does not assign tasks to users. That you have to push the schedule into Flow production tracking in order to assign users. Can you constrain the schedule based on specific resources being available, like a specific senior artist that you want to work on a shot or a sequence? So that's, again, because generative scheduling doesn't have the concept of people being assigned to particular shots. It doesn't have any way to say, hey, you need this particular person to be available. It just treats it as an overall department. I suppose in theory, you could set certain shots to be associated with a particular department that was like, you could create like the advanced comp department or something like that. And then you could say anyone in that department could do it. So that might be one way to approach that. We're curious how you start to use the tool. So, try stuff. Tell us what works or what doesn't, or what would make it work better. We're very curious to hear. Have you seen this applied to manufacturing application or utilized in other industries? If this is not the product, which products would you recommend for manufacturing? Okay, first of all, this is a very big topic. Talk to me later. Let me just say that. But yes, Flow production tracking is used by a lot of companies that manufacture a lot of different things. I'm not going to name companies because I don't know which ones I have permission to name, but they are major companies that you have heard of. Can you calculate more than one project at a time? Yes, you can. You can bring in as many projects as you want. You have to bring them in. I believe you, actually, I don't know the answer to this. I don't know if you have to bring them in one at a time or if you can do more than, if you can do 2 projects at once. I think you can do 2 projects at once or as many as you want to do at once. Let's see. Are there resources to help people get started with generative scheduling? It doesn't work out of the box for us, but maybe we're doing it wrong. Well, you know what? I'm going to talk about that right now. Okay, this I'm going to answer. I'm just looking. I don't want to spend too much time on Q&A because I do have the other half of the presentation. So if these are going to be addressed by the rest of the presentation, I'm going to skip them. Generate schedules. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I'm just going through these. I think I'm going to skip all of them. Does generative scheduling work across multiple projects, teammates who work on 2 to 3 projects at a time? Okay, so this is an interesting question. This person is asking, does generative scheduling work across multiple projects, teammates who work on 2 to 3 projects at a time? So generative scheduling isn't taking the people it's not taking the people that you have and then assigning them to tasks. It's telling how many people generative scheduling calculates you will most likely need to do the tasks based on the constraints that you have. So it doesn't really have a sense of, oh, this person is moving from this project to this project, but it does have a sense of, on July 5th, you probably will need 45 people in your comp department if you have this many comp tasks to complete by May 1st. Otherwise, if you don't have those 45 people, then you're probably not going to finish by May 1st based on the constraints that you've provided. So it's not keeping track of people moving from show to show, but you can set up and say, hey, I don't have any comp people, so please start my comp department on this date because they're all working on this other show. So you can start to set those kinds of constraints in order to get a schedule that's going to work for your studio. But it doesn't have a sense of people moving because it doesn't have a sense of people. It just has a sense of tasks and where they're arranged on the schedule and how they stack up against each other. One question we have about the training data for the AI. This is not the type of AI that's used for that. This is not the type of AI that uses training data. It doesn't use any training data. It's based on its own internal model. So I think that I got through most of these. I'm going to move on. I'm going to come back to Q&A at the end. Hopefully we'll get through all of these. You also can reach out to us to meet later. We love to talk to customers, but this is just for the sake of the webinar. I'm going to move on. We also have joining us today Kelsey Charlton, who is the product manager for this tool. So I'm also going to pull her in at the end when we're doing that Q&A to answer some of the questions that I don't know the answers to. Let's do one more poll before we continue. I'm curious to hear from you, not about your experience with this tool, but what your general challenges are when it comes to scheduling. I assume that a lot of you who are joining this webinar are people who are very interested in scheduling and who do a lot of scheduling in your everyday life. So what are the things that are the hardest for you? These are the things that are very curious to us, that we're very curious about, because we want to build tools that are going to be most helpful. Speaking of which, let's talk about generative scheduling. So if you would like to try generative scheduling, and if you have a subscription to Flow Production Tracking, you can go to your Flow Production Tracking site, go to the apps menu at the top of the screen, and choose Flow Generative Scheduling from the list of apps. This will immediately launch a separate web tab. That sounds like I'm 90 years old. It'll launch another website so that you can access Flow Generative Scheduling in a separate browser tab. If you don't have access, if you don't see it there, it may be a permissions issue. You do have to have permission to see Flow Generative Scheduling in order for it to appear in that app dropdown. So if you're not an admin on your site, you may have to request that your admin give you permission to see Flow Generative Scheduling if you want to try it out. Admins who are concerned about giving permission, in the Flow Generative Scheduling documentation, a lot of this stuff is just screenshots from the documentation, so which you can access from the help menu inside of Flow Generative Scheduling. It has this helpful graph which helps you to set permissions more granularly so that you can, for example, give someone access to look at Flow Generative Scheduling, but not push out schedules to the general production site. So it's possible to set the nuance of those permissions a little bit better. Once you get into Flow Generative Scheduling, if you just showed up, then you're probably going to have no existing playgrounds, as it says here. Playgrounds are our concept for where your scenarios live. We call them playgrounds very intentionally because we want people to understand that this is a place for you to try things out. There's nothing permanent here. There's nothing that's going to go into production. In fact, no one else can see it. Your playground is your private playground, and you can only see that data once it's pushed back into Flow Production Tracking or another tool. When you create a playground, it's going to ask you what your data source will be. So there's two possibilities here. You can use a schedule from Flow Production Tracking, or you can use a JSON file that's following our internal schema for how we export and import schedules from Flow Generative Scheduling. Let's talk about Flow Production Tracking. So in order to pull a schedule in from Flow Production Tracking, there's a few things you need to have in place. One is that you need to have departments associated with pipeline steps. So in Flow Production Tracking, Usually all of your tasks have a pipeline step. This page should assign which pipeline step is worked on by which department. And this is how generative scheduling will know what the departments are and which departments are going to be assigned which tasks. You can find this page in the menu in the upper right by choosing departments from the drop-down menu, and then that'll take you here and you can start assigning your pipeline steps. Then you actually need a schedule. You need items and you need tasks associated with them. I want to be really clear on what the minimum data that's required in order for Flow Generative Scheduling to be able to generate a schedule. It can take in more information than this, but this is the minimum that is required. The minimum is that we need to know how many tasks there are and in what departments they are. So we have to have tasks, they have to have pipeline steps, so those pipeline steps have to be associated with departments so that we have a list of tasks that are in departments. We just need to know how many there are. We need to know how long those tasks take. And that information is going to be pulled out of Flow Production Tracking from the duration field. Not going to be pulled from the bid days field. It's going to be pulled from the duration field. And then we need to know what tasks are dependent on each other. So if my animation task can't start until after layout is finished, then I need to set that dependency in Flow Production Tracking. You can see that here. This is a task template. So it's not going to, Flow Generative Scheduling is not going to look at the template. You need to actually apply this template to tasks in your schedule, in your project. But it will look at your project and it will look at the tasks in your project, and it's going to look for this duration information, 3 days to take to an animation task, and then the upstream, downstream dependencies. And you can do quite complex dependencies. You could say, oh, my animation and my lighting both start as soon as layout is finished. We don't wait for animation to be done to start lighting. You can set those kinds of constraints, but it has to be in Flow Production Tracking, and that's where Flow Generative Scheduling is going to pull it from. So then let's take a look at what it looks like. So we're pulling in the data, we're choosing our project here, and then we are naming this playground. So what are we trying to accomplish in this playground? This playground is going to be about looking at a new delivery date. So I'm going to schedule from September 2nd. So that means that I'm not going to change anything in my schedule that happens before September 2nd, because that stuff is either already in progress or I just don't want to mess with it. I want to start my changes on September 2nd. I want to create a new scenario with a new delivery date. I'm going to add in a new constraint. So this constraint is going to set, hang on one second, my video is pausing. There we go. So I'm going to add in a new constraint. I'm going to say that it needs to finish on June 2nd. So now my generative scheduling is going to only work on tasks between September 2nd and June 2nd. It's now made all these changes, and I can now dig in and look at the different tasks and look at what changes have been made. And you can even see on this graph where September 2nd starts. This is where all the changes start. You can see before it's September 2nd, the graph looks a little different because that stuff is locked, didn't get adjusted, whereas everything else got smooshed up because I changed the delivery date. And now I'm going to send to Flow Production Tracking. So now I send this scenario back to Flow Production Tracking. All this data is going to land in my existing schedule. It's not going to immediately land on the schedule, though. It shows up in this new column we've created called Proposed Start Date. And I have to choose to apply the proposed start date to the due date, task by task, in order for it to show up in the schedule. Now, I can do this in bulk. I can say select all, push over if I want to do that. But it's not going to immediately change my whole schedule. I have a chance to compare those dates by hand, bring over the stuff that I like, keep out the stuff that I don't, make manual changes as I see, oh, this is not going to work. I need to change this. So I get the chance to do that work, but it's going to show me it in the schedule next to my existing start dates. And it really is, when generative scheduling pushes out a quote unquote new schedule, that new schedule really consists just of new start dates, because we already know the duration. That's the information that it's taking in. So the information, the duration sets where the due date is. We're not changing the duration. The due date will be set based on what the start date is. And then it understands what the dependencies are. So it's going to make sure to set those start dates in such a way so that dependencies won't create conflicts. but it's really just a series of dates that get pushed into the start date field. So again, we've kept it very simple in this initial iteration, and we want to hear from you, whether that's enough and what else you would use. Let's talk about the other way that we could get data into Flow Generative Scheduling, which is using a JSON file, the OSF schema. So the OSF schema is our internal format that we use to talk about a schedule. You can actually download a demo schedule from our documentation. If you don't have a schedule or don't want to use one of your schedules in Flow Production Tracking, then you can just pull the demo schedule down from the Flow Generative Scheduling docs page and import that directly. It's a massive schedule, and it gives you all the stuff that you might want to play around with in order to really work with it with a big complex schedule. We also have a page that indicates what the OSF format is and gives you a detailed understanding of it for folks who are building your own scheduling tools. Our goal with all of our Flow platform tools is that they are as open as possible so that you can build your own tools so that other people can create schedules that push themselves into Flow Generative Scheduling. Flow Generative Scheduling is available to users of Flow Production Tracking, but it does not require Flow Production Tracking in order for one to use it. As long as you are able to output a schedule in this open scheduling format, in this JSON format, then you should be able to push a schedule into Flow Generative Scheduling. Let me be clear now about something. I think we've had a few questions about this. Flow Generative Scheduling is not an additional cost. Your Flow Production Tracking subscription includes Flow Generative Scheduling. So if you have a Flow Production Tracking subscription, you also have access to Flow Generative Scheduling. If you do not have an access to Flow Production Tracking subscription, you can start a free trial of Flow Production Tracking. Anyone can start a free trial of Flow Production Tracking, and then you can get access to Flow Generative Scheduling that way. It is available with the Flow Production Tracking free trial. I actually want to shoot out another poll. This poll is very important because this poll is, we're asking you whether you want to talk to us. Just to be clear, it says, do you want someone to contact you in the poll? The person who would be contacting you is me. So this is me asking you, would you like to meet with me at another time in order to discuss this tool? I have colleagues who may also join the party, but it's largely me. So just answer this poll based on whether or not you want to be contacted and whether or not you want further questions. Again, we're going to go back into Q&A mode, and I'll try to answer as many of these questions as possible, but it's entirely possible I won't get to all of them. So if you have questions and you want to make sure they get answered, great way to get them answered is to answer yes to this little poll. What else have we got? This is it. So from our perspective, we really believe that scheduling is one of those tasks that doesn't need to be manually done, that there will be a day when, we just expect that these kinds of manual time-consuming tasks that we get help from the computers, which is really all AI should be, is help from computers to do tasks that will take me a long time. It's what computers have done for so long and so well. So that's what we're trying to accomplish with Flow Generative Scheduling. We also want to hear from you. We want you to help us author this feature and tell us what generative scheduling should be and should do. Let me go back into Q&A mode. By the way, if you want to do a free trial of Flow Production Tracking, which will also give you access to generative scheduling, check out the QR code. It'll take you to the site. It's very easy to sign up. Even if you are working at a studio where you have access to Flow Production Tracking, but you don't have access to Flow Generative Scheduling on the studio site, feel free to sign up for a trial, and then you can play around with your own site for 30 days. And then there's also the second QR code leads you to the docs for Flow Production, for Flow Generative Scheduling. You could access those docs inside the tool by just going to the help menu, but you could also access them here using the QR code. All right, so we got 18 minutes. We're going to do these Q&As, as many of them as we can. I noticed that someone raised their hand. did use the Zoom tool for raising your hand. I don't know how to respond to that. I see you raising your hand, but I cannot call on you. So if you could answer, if you put your question in the Q&A, I will hopefully get to it. Let's talk about it. So we've got a question in here is, what if you have a freelancer start an end date? So you want to say, hey, this freelancer is starting now and ending now. So you can only give this freelancer tasks during that window. So because generative scheduling doesn't have a sense of individual people, you can only give a department a start and end date. You can't give a specific person a start and end date unless you're going to turn that person into a one-person department. But having a one-person department sort of defeats the purpose of generative scheduling, because then you're just essentially assigning the tasks to that person. Whereas generative scheduling is trying to take a group of tasks and shuffle them around. We're getting questions about the resource planner tool, whether Flow Generative Scheduling is integrated with the resource planner inside of Flow Production Tracking. It is not currently integrated with Resource Planner. It's something that we're considering. We would love to hear your feedback about that. So here's a question. I'm going to sort of paraphrase the question. The question is about when people have days off, vacation days, holidays. So the schedule that Flow Generative Scheduling uses to know when you're working is the work schedule inside of Flow Production Tracking. So work schedule is not a feature that everybody uses in Flow Production Tracking. You may not have seen it before. It is in that upper right-hand menu. That's what allows you to set holidays. It's what allows you to set the number of hours in a day. And you can change individual people's work schedules. So you can also give a group of people a holiday. For example, if you've got some people in Canada and some people in the US and they have different holidays. So Flow Generative Scheduling can look at the overall work schedule for the studio or for the project. It can't look at the work schedule for a person because it doesn't have the sense of persons. It only has the sense of departments. This is feedback that we have gotten, so we're definitely interested to hear how you would expect or how you would like to see the tool deal with days off or to deal with people's individual schedules. It can't deal with individual people's schedules because individual people, it doesn't know who's doing which task. But this we're curious how you would expect it to work in that way. But you can set holidays for the studio and we'll respect those. So here's a question. If you have an existing schedule and need to make another scenario, will the next push override the old production tracking assignments? So when I went through and showed you that proposed start date, that's where the new scenario will land. So if you've got another scenario in the proposed start date column, it will overwrite that. But it won't overwrite your existing schedule until you accept your proposed start date inside of production tracking. Production tracking is not going to be able to hold multiple scenarios. So you're going to keep your scenarios inside of generative scheduling, and then when you're ready to get them in production tracking, you can push them there. You will keep them in generative scheduling though. If for some reason you wanted to bring in a different scenario and go backwards somehow, you could do that, but it wouldn't have the updated information of what's in your schedule currently. Do tasks need to already exist in Flow production tracking for the generative scheduling to work, or can the tool use makeshift tasks based on department bids? So the tasks do need to exist already. You need to have a task that has been created. It doesn't have to have a start and end date, but it does have to be in the tool, and it does have to have a duration, and it does have to have a department and dependencies. But you have to have an actual task, not an idea of a task or a bid of a task. Flow production tracking doesn't really have the concept of a bidded task as opposed to an actual task. If you have a bidding tool that you use, if it's a tool that you have developed internally, then you could actually get your bidding tool to push out. I'm talking to the pipeline folks, to the software developers among us now. You could get that bidding tool to push out the OSF format and import that into Flow Generative Scheduling. So then you could possibly run a scheduling scenario on a bid before it ever hits Flow Production Tracking. But then you do need to have it output that JSON format. How are existing tasks that are already assigned to specific users affected when we push a new schedule? So this is something that I went through pretty quickly in one of the videos, but essentially there's a moment where you get to choose where you're beginning your scheduling. You're saying, I want to schedule everything that happens after this date. Anything before this date, don't touch it. So that's where you get to decide, hey, this stuff that's already in progress or that's already assigned. It doesn't look at status. So if it doesn't look at whether or not a task is in progress, and it doesn't look at assigned, it doesn't care whether the task is assigned or not. It just looks at the start date, due date. So that's how it's going to decide whether or not that task should be adjusted, is whether or not it happens before that schedule from date that you're asked for as you create your scenario. So now we have a question. I really like this question. To ensure compliance, our company uses task templates that come with a list of standard tasks, some of which would be set to a not applicable condition, an NA condition, by default until needed. So these are sort of dummy tasks that don't actually exist that can be turned on by changing the status from NA, from not applicable, to like in progress or ready to start. Can we exclude specific conditions from being scheduled? Can we leave out tasks that are set to NA or tasks that are set to omit? Shots that are set to omit. If a shot is omitted, is it going to still be in the schedule? The answer is that currently generative scheduling does not look at statuses. It does not care what the status of the asset is. It does not care what the status of the tasks are. It just looks at the start and end date, the duration, that kind of stuff. So if that's something that's really important to you for this tool to be useful, if you really need it to be looking at those status fields in order to figure out what should be scheduled and what shouldn't, then that's feedback that we need to hear. So speak up. I'm just going through these Q&A stuff. We've got one question in here. Are there permissions to ensure that only qualified people can push scenarios out to Flow Production Tracking? Yes, there are permissions. There's a whole section on this in the docs. I went over that very quickly in that section, but yes, there's a section in the docs for that. Folks are asking whether they're going to get a recording of this webinar. Yes, just by registering for the webinar, you do get a recording for it. I have a lot of questions in here. There's no way I'm going to get all of these questions. Just throwing that out there. So here's an interesting question. Can you add contingencies into the model? For example, I expect tasks to be accurate, but maybe I want a resource to have a 10% buffer. I know that a lot of people do stuff like that in their scheduling, that they create sort of contingency like 10%, 15%. Generative scheduling doesn't have any concept of contingency currently. It's going to look at the data that you have in production tracking. So if you have that 10% contingency in your production tracking data and your durations there, then it will come in with that. Is there a way to export your schedule without importing back into production tracking? So yes, you can export the schedule in our open schedule format, which is essentially a JSON text file. That text file, however, is not really human readable. It is scriptable. It is highly scriptable. So if you've got a pipeline department that has a way to make that visible for you, to sort of bring that up, then you can definitely export it and import it into other tools. But since this is a new tool, we're not currently aware of other tools that will accept the open scheduling format. So we would expect you to be doing that. I see that someone has raised their hand. Caitlin has raised their hand. Caitlin, if you can put your question in the Q&A. I don't really have any way to interact with people via the raising hand function. There's too many of you and just me. Oh, you're raising your hand because I'm answering your question. Well, I hope you liked my answer. Moving on. If there are already artists associated with tasks that get changed, do they get emails about everything that has changed on their schedule? This is a great question, Peter. Um, so the answer is maybe. The flow production tracking lets you be notified via email about various things. So you get to set your notification settings inside of flow production tracking to decide whether you want to be emailed when these types of things happen. One thing that I might suggest is that you can see as an admin what people's notifications are, that you might want to check to make sure that no one has turned on notifications to get notified every time that their tasks move dates. You might want to just say, hey, I'm going to turn that off so that they don't get, 80 emails, or warn them or something like that. But you were able to actually change other people's notification settings as an admin. Here's an interesting part. A good question. What exactly is the generative part in quick summary? Why is this generative scheduling? What is it generating? This is really more of a semantic question. When we talk about generative AI, we're talking usually about AI that's able to come up with something new usually out of what we call the large language models. So where it's AI that's imitating a large data set. In our case, our model is not imitative. It's not imitating other schedules. It's measuring the schedule against an ideal, which is essentially a flat line, if I'm really going to simplify a lot of complicated math. It turns out that taking a schedule and adjusting the tasks in order to level out the resourcing is a mathematically extremely complex problem, to the point where you could essentially work on that problem forever and never come up with a single solution for it. You can never come up with the schedule. You can try to optimize the schedule and try to come up with a solution, but there's too many variables for there to be a single correct solution to this math problem, essentially. And so that's the reason that we call this generative, is because essentially we're coming up with a solution to a problem. The same way that a generative AI that generates an image is coming up with a solution to the problem of make a picture of a cat eating an ice cream cone. Yeah, that's how I'm going to answer that question. Moving on. Will it tell you if you're trying to do something that isn't possible based on the constraints? Like, I can't add 10 more people to hit the deadline. So generative scheduling does allow you to set constraints to say, hey, I have 45 people, so try to keep it under 45 people as while we finish on September 5th and start on May 1st. It will show you that line, that 45 people line. It's like a black horizontal line. But the way the math works, and those who are production managers understand this math very well, that if tasks take a certain amount of time and you have a certain number of tasks, then you actually need a certain number of people in order to complete those tasks within the allotted time. And that if you say, move the deadline up so you don't have as much time, you can't do the same amount of work in less time with the same amount of people. It just is not how time works. Now, it's true there's lots of things that you can do in order to try to become more efficient. But essentially those things come down to trying to do the tasks faster. And generative scheduling assumes that the task takes however long the task takes. It has a duration field that doesn't change. And so it will show you that, and it will try even to meet that constraint. It will try to keep it under that constraint as best it can. But it will not, it has to respect the time constraints that it gives you. So it sort of applies the resource constraint last, and then gives you a visual marker of where it actually went over. So I hope that answers your question. I think that's going to be where we finish. I thank you all for taking the time to join us. This was a very well attended webinar, which I get really excited about. That's the kind of thing that people like me get excited about. Um, I hope that you learned a lot. I hope that those of you who are interested in being contacted, that we can find some time to get together. I look forward to meeting you and hearing more. Um, and me and Kelsey are going to talk a lot about all this later, and we'll see what happens next. Thank you all so much. That's the end of our webinar.